The axe hit the fence post so clean and true that every man in Dusthaven, Colorado turned his head and forgot, for one long stunned moment, exactly what he had been doing with his life. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Dusthaven sat like a weathered old coin in the crease between the Rockies and the open grasslands, a place where the wind never fully made up its mind, and the people were the same way. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, dragging with it a saloon, a general store, a livery, and all the complicated hopes that tend to follow iron tracks westward. There were about 200 souls living in and around Dusthaven, most of them men, most of them scarred in one way or another by the particular kind of loneliness that the frontier manufactures with remarkable efficiency. They built their fences. They drove their cattle. They drank their whiskey in the evenings and tried not to think too hard about the things they had left behind or the things they might never find. Henry Sutton was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the particular way that people sometimes mistake for calm. He had a ranch 3 miles east of town, 80 acres of decent grazing land with a creek that ran well enough in the wet months and thinned to something desperate come August. He had built the ranch house himself over the course of one brutal summer, every plank and beam selected personally, and the result was solid and square and entirely without softness, which was something people also said about Henry himself. He had come to Colorado from Tennessee 8 years ago with his older brother, Thomas, and a mule named Ezra who had since died of old age and been mourned more genuinely than most humans in the county. Thomas had married a woman from town, Martha, and they had 2 small boys and a garden that Martha tended with the kind of fierce devotion that Henry admired from a respectful distance. Thomas had been trying to get Henry married for 3 years. "You need somebody," Thomas told him at least once a fortnight, sometimes more, leaning on whatever fence or gate happened to be near them when the mood struck. "You are living out there by yourself like some kind of hermit prophet, and it is not good for a man." "I am perfectly fine," Henry would say. "You are not fine. You are 31 years old and you talk to your horses more than you talk to people. My horses are better conversationalists." Thomas would shake his head and go back to whatever he had been doing, and Henry would go back to his ranch and his horses and the long, clean silence of the land around him, and he would tell himself that he was, in fact, perfectly fine. He did not need a woman on the frontier. He had never seen a woman choose this life freely, fully, without reservation. They came out here because their husbands brought them, or because they had no options left, or because the advertisements in Eastern newspapers painted the West in colors that bore no resemblance to the actual dust and hardship and bone-deep cold of a Colorado winter. They came and then they endured, and eventually they either left or they went quietly to pieces in very dignified ways. Henry had watched it happen. He had watched his own mother do it, back in Tennessee, not on the frontier proper, but in a hard rural place far from anything comfortable, watched her fold inward year by year like a flower that never got enough sun. He had told himself, at some age young enough that the thought had calcified into something he stopped questioning, that he would not do that to a woman, would not bring somebody to this life who had not truly and fully chosen it. And since he had never met a woman who had truly and fully chosen it, well, there was the sum of the matter. So when the stage arrived on the 15th of April, 1878, and a woman stepped down from it carrying a traveling bag in one hand and a short-handled felling axe in the other, Henry Sutton noticed the axe first. That said something about her immediately. Most women stepping off a stage in a frontier town were carrying a hat box or a carpet bag or a small child. This woman carried her axe the way other people carry umbrellas, like it was simply a sensible thing to have on one's person at all times, which, it turned out, was exactly how she felt about it. Henry had been standing outside the general store picking up a spool of wire when the stage came in. He watched the woman step down, watched her survey the main street of Dusthaven with a pair of clear gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing, watched her square her shoulders, and take in the mud and the mismatched buildings and the half-dozen men staring at her with their mouths slightly open. And he watched her expression do a complicated thing that was not quite satisfaction and not quite amusement but something in between. "Excuse me," she said to nobody in particular, which meant she said it to everybody. "Can anybody tell me where I might find the land office?" Silas Greer from the hardware store pointed left. He was normally a talkative man, but the axe had struck him temporarily mute. "Thank you," the woman said, and walked in that direction with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had somewhere to be and fully intended to get there. Henry watched her go. He noticed that she was perhaps 5 or 6 years younger than him, somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical hat, and a coat that was good quality but well-traveled. He noticed that she did not look around for someone to carry her bag. He noticed that the axe had a worn handle, which meant it was not new, which meant she actually used it. He picked up his wire and went home. Her name was Celia Keating, and she had come from Boston, Massachusetts, though she had not lived there her whole life. She was 25 years old, the eldest daughter of an Irish-born carpenter named Patrick Keating, who had brought his family to a logging settlement in northern Maine when Celia was 8 years old. And it was there in the deep pine forests of that cold and unforgiving place that she had learned to split wood, set traps, read the sky for weather, and generally operate in the world as though her own 2 hands were her most reliable tool, because they were. Her mother, Bridget, had died of fever when Celia was 15, and from that age forward she had kept the household, raised her 2 younger brothers, and assisted her father with his work whenever he needed an extra pair of skilled hands, which was frequently. Patrick Keating had died the previous autumn of a bad heart, sudden and without warning, and in the quiet, terrible weeks that followed his death, Celia had done what she always did when the world tilted underneath her. She thought very hard about what she actually wanted, stripped of all the obligations and arrangements that had accumulated around her life like moss on a stone. Her brothers were grown now, both of them married and settled in Maine. She was 25 and unmarried and perfectly competent, and the logging settlement felt, without her father in it, like a coat that was 2 sizes too small. She had been reading about homestead land in Colorado for 2 years. She had been reading about it the way some people read novels, with her whole self engaged, something in her chest responding to the particular quality of the landscape as it was described, the open sky, the hard winters, the possibility of something entirely your own. The Homestead Act of 1862 had made it legal for a woman to file a claim on 160 acres of public land if she was the head of her household, which Celia, as an unmarried woman of independent means, legally was. She had taken the money from her father's small estate, bought her train ticket, and come west. The axe had belonged to her father. She had brought it because it was the best axe she owned, because she intended to build with it, and because she found, in those first raw weeks after his death, that carrying it made her feel less alone. The land office in Dusthaven was run by a man named Gerald Pratt, who was deeply suspicious of everyone who walked through his door on general principle, but who was particularly suspicious of Celia because she was a woman filing alone, and she seemed entirely too confident about it. He looked at her paperwork 3 times. He asked her twice whether she had a husband. She told him twice, with increasing precision, that she did not. He eventually, with the air of a man performing a great personal sacrifice, registered her claim on a 160-acre parcel 4 miles northeast of town, along a branch of the same creek that ran through several other properties in the area, including, though neither of them knew this yet, Henry Sutton's ranch. Celia thanked him with a warmth she did not fully feel, rolled her claim papers into her bag beside the axe, and went to find lodging for the night. She found it at the Dusthaven boarding house, run by a woman named Nell Briggs, who was somewhere between 50 and ancient, and who had survived 3 husbands, a cholera outbreak, and a fire that had taken the original boarding house roof, and who was therefore not easily impressed but was occasionally entertained. Nell gave Celia the corner room with the good window and brought her a bowl of beef stew and watched her eat it with the evaluating eye of someone deciding whether a new animal was worth keeping. "You filed a claim," Nell said. "I did. On your own. On my own." Nell sat down across from her with a cup of coffee that she did not offer to share. "There are 2 or 3 women in this area who farm or ranch, most of them married into it. You are the first woman I have seen come out here by herself with a land claim." "There will be more," Celia said. Nell considered this. "Maybe," she said. "In the meantime, you should know that the land northeast of here has good water access, but the soil gets rocky past the first quarter-mile. The winters will kill you if you are not ready. You will need to get your structure up before October or you will not survive the first cold season." Celia put down her spoon. "You know this area well." "I have been here 11 years, Nell said, not without a certain private grimness. "Then I hope you will let me ask questions of you," Celia said. "I know how to work hard, I know how to build, but I do not know this particular land yet, and I know enough to know that I do not know it." Nell looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee. "You can ask questions," she said. "I will charge you $3 a week for the room, and you can chop my woodpile on Saturdays if you want to keep your hand in. I have been letting that pile go since my last boarder left." "Done," said Celia, and they shook hands across the empty stew bowl, and something that would grow into a genuine friendship began its life quietly in that dining room. The next morning, Celia walked out to her land for the first time. She did it alone, with her axe and her pack and a rough hand-drawn map from Gerald Pratt, and the 4 miles northeast took her through the edge of town, along a wagon road that became a trail, through a stretch of young cottonwood trees that were just beginning to show their first green, and finally to a slight rise where the creek branched and the land opened on her left into a broad, gentle slope of grassland, with a view of the mountains to the west that stopped her mid-step and held her there in the early morning light. Just breathing, it was real. She had known it would be real. She had planned for it to be real, but standing on her own land for the first time was different from any imagining she had done. The mountains were still carrying their snow. The creek made its sound at the base of the slope. A hawk moved in a long, patient circle over the grass, and she watched it until it was gone. Then she turned around and started taking stock, which was the practical half of her responding to the beautiful half, because Celia Keating had long ago learned that the beautiful half needed the practical half to function in the world. She walked the creek line, tested the soil with her fingers, noted where the land was level enough to build, noted where existing timber could be accessed without too long a haul, noted the direction of the prevailing wind and where a windbreak might be planted. She worked through the morning until the sun was high, and then she sat on a flat boulder by the creek and ate the bread and dried meat she had brought and made her lists. She needed to fell trees. She needed to haul stone. She needed a foundation before she could think about walls. She would need to hire labor for the heavier work. She had enough money from her father's estate to last perhaps a year if she was careful, and she intended to be very careful indeed. She did not know, sitting there on that flat boulder making her lists, that the man who owned the land to the southwest of her claim had already noticed her axe. It was 3 days before Henry Sutton encountered Celia Keating directly, and it happened because of the creek. The branch of the creek that ran through Celia's land and through the edge of Henry's ranch had a particular place where it ran under a natural stone shelf, and in high spring runoff it tended to back up against this shelf and flood a low section of Henry's western pasture. Henry had been meaning for 2 years to clear the debris from around that shelf and dig the channel a few feet wider, and he kept not doing it because there were always 17 other things that needed doing first. The spring of 1878 was wetter than usual, and the backup was worse than he had seen it, and on the 4th day after the stage arrived, he pulled on his boots at dawn and went up to deal with the creek, because he had 3 horses in that western pasture, and the water was creeping toward their shelter. He came around the stand of cottonwoods that grew along the upper bank and found that someone had already started the work. The stone shelf had been partially cleared. Fresh cuts in the bank showed where a spade had opened a wider channel, and there, knee-deep in the creek water in what appeared to be a man's canvas trousers and a heavy shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, was the woman with the axe, using a long-handled spade to heave gravel and debris out of the channel with steady, methodical strokes. Henry stopped walking. Celia, who had heard him coming because she always heard things, did not stop working. "Your pasture," she said. "Yes," Henry said. "I noticed the backup when I was walking my claim line yesterday evening. The overflow was heading into your low ground, and I had nothing else pressing first thing this morning." She heaved another load of gravel up the bank. "I am Celia Keating. I filed on the land northeast of here last week. We are neighbors." Henry looked at the cleared section of bank. She had moved a substantial amount of material. He looked at the woman who had moved it. Her arms were lean and strong, and she was working with the economy of someone who had done physical labor for most of her life. "Henry Sutton," he said. He came down the bank, pulled off his own coat, and stepped into the water on the opposite side of the channel. The cold hit him through his trousers like a fist. "You did not have to do this." "I know I did not have to do it," Celia said. "The creek crosses my land upstream. If it is blocked here, it causes trouble for both of us. Doing it made sense." They worked side by side for the better part of an hour, the creek running cold and loud around their legs, neither of them saying much because the work required attention, and they were both people who gave work the attention it required. When the channel was clear and the water was running free and fast, they climbed the bank and stood in the thin spring sunlight with wet boots and muddy arms. "Where are you from?" Henry said. It was not the question he had meant to ask first, but it came out ahead of the others. "Maine originally, Boston most recently." She was wringing water from her shirt sleeve with calm efficiency. "Before you say it, I have heard it." "Heard what?" "Whatever you were about to say about women and the frontier." Henry had not been about to say anything of the sort, or perhaps he had been about to say something adjacent to it without fully realizing it, because he paused long enough that Celia gave him a brief, knowing look. "I was not going to say anything," he said. "Good," she said. "I was going to ask how long you have had the axe." The question surprised her. He could see it in the slight adjustment of her expression, the way her guard recalibrated. "It was my father's," she said after a moment. "He was a carpenter and a woodcutter. I started using it when I was about 10. I have done most of my own repairs with it since I was in my mid-teens." Henry nodded. He looked at the axe which she had left on the bank in the grass. The handle was dark with long use. The head was well maintained, no rust, edge kept up. A working tool, properly cared for. "I need to build a structure before winter," Celia said. "I have the plans and I have some savings to hire work. But I also know that finding reliable labor in a frontier town is complicated." "It is," Henry agreed. "Do you know who is worth hiring in this area and who is not?" He looked at her directly for a moment. She looked back without flinching, which he noticed. "I know most people in a 10-mile radius," he said. "What kind of structure?" "A cabin first. Single room, 16 by 20 feet, good solid timber construction with a stone foundation. I want it tight enough to hold through a Colorado winter and built to expand when I have more means." "That is a sensible plan." "I generally try to have sensible plans." He almost smiled. He was not sure why. "Come to my ranch on Friday," he said. "My brother and I will be there, and he knows everyone in the county. He can tell you who to hire and who to avoid." Celia looked at him with those clear gray eyes for a moment, as though measuring the offer for traps. Then she nodded. "Friday morning. Thank you." They parted at the edge of the cottonwood stand, Celia heading northeast along the creek and Henry heading southwest toward his horses, and he walked the whole way back to his pasture thinking about the way she had said, "I generally try to have sensible plans," not defensive about it, not trying to convince him of anything, just stating a fact. He had never met anyone quite like that before. He was not sure what to do with the observation, so he filed it alongside the business of the creek and the fence wire and the spring calves, and went about his day. Friday came with a clear sky and a wind from the northwest. Celia arrived at the Sutton Ranch at 8 in the morning on foot, having walked the 4 miles from Dusthaven because she did not yet have a horse, with her hat straight and her coat buttoned and her pack over one shoulder. Henry was out by the barn when she came up the road, and he watched her cross the yard with that same purposeful stride she had stepping off the stage, like she was always going somewhere and always intended to arrive. Thomas was inside eating breakfast and he nearly spilled his coffee when Henry brought her in. Martha was at the stove with the 2 small boys around her feet, and she turned and looked at Celia with an expression that moved rapidly from surprise to something considerably warmer. "Good morning," Martha said. "You must be the woman who filed the Northeast claim. I heard about you from Nell Briggs. Sit down. Have coffee." Thomas was already pulling out a chair with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting 3 years for Henry to bring a woman to his table, and was trying not to make it too obvious that he felt this way. Henry gave him a look. Thomas gave him back a look of pure innocence. Celia sat down, took the coffee Martha offered, and began asking Thomas questions about local labor with the directness and precision of a contractor reviewing bids. Thomas, who was the more sociable of the 2 brothers and knew everyone in the county for 40 miles in every direction, was immediately charmed and also genuinely useful. He named 4 men who were reliable builders. He named 2 who were not to be trusted with payment in advance. He mentioned that a man named Cord Whitfield ran a small lumber mill 8 miles east and had the best cut timber in the area. He said that the Navarro brothers, Miguel and Juan, who worked most of the ranches in the area seasonally, were the best all-around labor available, and that they were currently between contracts. Celia wrote everything down in a small notebook she produced from her coat pocket. Henry refilled his coffee and leaned against the counter and watched her work through her questions, and he thought about what he had said to himself for 8 years about women and the frontier. He thought about it with more discomfort than usual, which was new. "Can I ask you something?" Martha said, when the practical business was mostly done and they were all sitting with second coffees in the morning light. "Did you really come out here alone, from Boston?" "From Maine originally," Celia said, "but yes, alone." "Weren't you frightened?" Celia considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I was frightened of failing," she said, "of getting here and finding that I had miscalculated something essential, but the journey itself," she shook her head slightly. "I have been capable of handling myself since I was 15. The journey was just a long version of that." Martha looked at her for a moment with something very close to admiration. Henry looked at his coffee. "What made you choose Colorado?" Thomas asked. "The land reports," Celia said. "The water access, the growing season." And she paused as though deciding something. "I wanted to be somewhere with enough sky to breathe properly. Maine is beautiful, but it is dark, all that forest." She smiled a small smile that transformed her face briefly into something less composed and more alive. "I wanted to be able to see what was coming." Henry looked up at that. He did not say anything, but he looked up. After Celia left, walking back toward town with her notebook of names and her practical hat and her pack, Thomas turned to Henry with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck. "Henry," Thomas said. "Do not," Henry said. "I am just saying, Thomas." "She is remarkable," Martha said from the stove, as though settling the matter definitively. "And she needs good neighbors. Make sure you are one." Henry went out to the barn. He spent 2 hours doing work that could have waited a week, just to have something to do with his hands while his brain went through its habitual arguments and found them, for the first time, harder to sustain than usual. The building began in the 2nd week of May. Celia had hired Miguel and Juan Navarro within 2 days of visiting the Sutton Ranch, had contracted with Cord Whitfield at the lumber mill for the timber she needed, and had arranged to borrow a draft horse from a neighboring rancher named Abe Crawley for the hauling. She had also purchased 2 laying hens and a rooster from Nell Briggs and transported them to her land in a wooden crate she built herself one evening in the boarding house yard. which Nell watched with an expression that had given up trying to be surprised and was simply satisfied. Miguel and Juan Navarro were brothers in their late 20s, compact and efficient, and possessed of a professional dignity that Henry had described accurately. They had been building and repairing structures across Colorado and New Mexico for 6 years, and they knew their work completely. They assessed Celia's site, approved her foundation placement, and began the stonework with no comment on the fact that their employer was a woman, because they had both been raised by a woman who would have found that worth commenting on to be rather stupid, and they were not stupid men. The foundation took 9 days. The walls began going up on a Wednesday in late May. Henry came to see the progress on a Saturday, which he told himself was because he was passing that way on the road to the Whitfield Mill, and not because he had found himself thinking about the creek project and the sensible plans, and the morning light on the mountain view that he happened to know you could see very clearly from the slight rise on Celia's claim. He came over the rise and found Celia on the half-built wall, standing at the top of it 8 feet off the ground, holding a timber in place at the corner joint, while Miguel stood below holding the rope and Juan drove the pin. "More to the left," she was saying, not to Miguel and Juan, who knew perfectly well where the timber went, but apparently to herself, because she then moved it 1 inch to the left, seemed satisfied, and said now to Juan. Henry sat on his horse and watched the pin go in and watched her check the corner with a small level she produced from her vest pocket, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, she is not enduring this. She is building it. There is a difference. "Sutton," she said, noticing him. She climbed down the wall the way you would descend a ladder, which is to say without any apparent concern for the height. "Good morning. Good morning. How is the foundation holding?" "Perfectly. Miguel and Juan do exceptional work." She wiped her hands on her trousers. "Do you have time to look at the roofline plans? I have been going back and forth on the pitch, and Nell says the snow load in this area can be considerable." "It can be," Henry said, and dismounted, and found himself standing beside her over a hand-drawn plan spread on a flat rock in the morning sun while she explained her roofline options, and he told her what he knew about Colorado winter snow loads, and they went back and forth for 20 minutes with the particular engaged ease of 2 people who are both thinking clearly and enjoying the fact that the other person is also thinking clearly. He stayed for the better part of the morning. He told himself this was neighborly. He came back the following Saturday and told himself the same thing. The 3rd Saturday he came, and she had made coffee on a small camp stove she had set up near the building site, and she handed him a cup without asking whether he wanted one, because she had noticed that he always arrived at roughly the same time, and that the camp stove was always going. He took the cup and they walked the perimeter of the nearly complete structure together, and she told him about a family of red foxes that had set up a den in the rocks below the creek shelf, and he told her about the creek's behavior in August when the water dropped, and they talked until Miguel called out that the ridgepole was ready, and Celia handed him her empty cup and went back to work. Henry rode home very slowly. Thomas found him that evening out by the corral fence, watching nothing in particular with an expression Thomas had not seen on his brother's face in 8 years of observation. "How is the building coming along?" Thomas said with the careful casualness of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. "The roofline is good," Henry said. "She pitched it steeper than the standard. It will shed the snow better." Thomas looked at his brother's face. "Henry," he said gently. "I know," Henry said. "Do you?" Henry turned his head and looked at his brother. "I do not know anything yet," he said, which was honest and also, for Henry Sutton, who had known what he thought about most things for most of his adult life, remarkable. "That is a start," Thomas said. The cabin was finished in the 2nd week of June, and the evening it was done, Celia stood inside it for a long time without moving. The walls were straight and tight. The floor was packed earth for now, planks to come. The fireplace at the north wall drew perfectly, which she had tested twice. The 2 windows she had framed faced east and west so she would have morning light and evening light. The door faced south. Everything was exactly as she had planned it, built with her hands and the hands of the Navarro brothers and the honest labor of 6 weeks, and it was hers, clean and solid and real. She put her palm flat on the wall and held it there. Then she went outside and sat on the stone step she had cut herself from a flat boulder dragged up from the creek, and she watched the mountains go gold in the late light, and she let herself feel, for the first time since she had left Maine, something uncomplicated, something that was simply satisfaction. She had done it. She had come here and she had done it. The celebration in Dusthaven for the 4th of July that year was a modest affair by Eastern standards but enthusiastic by frontier ones, involving a fiddle player named Pete Dolan, a great deal of pie, a horseshoe contest, and enough goodwill to briefly paper over the various grievances and disputes that were the ongoing infrastructure of any small town. Celia came from her land for it, having now moved into her cabin, and she wore a dress for the first time since she had arrived, a dark green wool that she had brought from Boston and that fit her well, and her auburn hair was down and braided simply over one shoulder. Henry saw her from across the square, and for a moment he simply stood there, which was becoming a pattern he recognized with some alarm. She was talking to Nell Briggs and a woman named Clara Dawes whose husband farmed the river bottom south of town, and she was laughing at something Clara had said, and the laugh was genuine and unguarded, different from the competent professional manner she wore like a second coat when she was working. He crossed the square without entirely deciding to. "Mr. Sutton," she said when he appeared at her elbow. "Miss Keating," he said. He nodded to Nell and Clara. Nell had the expression of a woman who is very pleased with something she is pretending she has nothing to do with. "We were just discussing whether Clara's recipe for blackberry pie is better than mine," Celia said. "It is a scientific question," Clara said, "and the only way to settle it is for Mr. Sutton to taste both and give a verdict." "I accept this responsibility," Henry said, and Clara laughed and went to fetch the pie, and Nell drifted away with suspicious purpose, and Henry and Celia were standing by the edge of the square with the fiddle starting up and the children running, and the long summer evening going golden around them. "Are you well settled in the cabin?" Henry asked. "Very well. It holds the warmth remarkably well at night, better than I expected." She looked at the crowd with that clear measuring gaze of hers. "Your town is interesting. I have been here 2.5 months and I still feel like I am only seeing the surface of it. It takes time. These people have been through things together that create bonds you cannot see from the outside." "What things?" He thought about it. The winter of '73 was very hard. There were people who would not have made it without their neighbors. That kind of thing changes how people fit together. Celia was quiet for a moment. "I have not been through a Colorado winter yet." "You will be," he said. "And you will be fine." She looked at him then directly, the way she always did. "That is the first time you have said that to me." "Said what?" "That I will be fine. Most people, when they find out I am out there alone, say things that amount to 'I hope you manage' or 'that is very brave,' which is a polite way of saying they expect me to fail or leave. You said I will be fine." Henry met her gaze. "I have watched you work," he said. "I said what I believe." The moment between them was quiet and particular, like a plucked string still vibrating. Then Clara came back with 2 pieces of pie and the moment shifted, but it did not disappear. It simply moved somewhere slightly below the surface, where it continued to do things to both of them that neither was fully prepared for. It was the dancing that undid Henry Sutton. Not immediately, not with any single dramatic moment. But Pete Dolan started up a reel around 9 o'clock when the sky was just going from gold to purple, and half the town was on the square dancing, including Thomas, who could not resist a reel on principle. And Henry was standing with his back against the general store wall watching, and noticing that Celia was also watching, not dancing, standing at the edge of the crowd with something in her face that was almost wistful. "Do you dance?" he heard himself say. She looked at him with a slight smile. "I do you?" "I am not known for it," he said, "but I know how." He held out his hand, not entirely sure where that had come from, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she took it and they joined the reel, and he found that he danced better than he remembered, or perhaps it had something to do with how she moved, which was unsurprisingly capable and light-footed, because of course she moved well. Celia Keating moved well at everything she did. They danced through 3 songs, and he did not step on her feet and she did not step on his, and at the end of the 3rd song they were both slightly breathless and her face was flushed from the exertion and she was laughing again, that genuine unguarded laugh, and he thought very clearly, I am in trouble. July moved into August. The creek dropped as he had warned her it would, and Celia dug out the channel above her intake point herself, using the skills she had developed in Maine for managing water sources in dry seasons. Her kitchen garden was doing better than most, because she had amended her soil with composted material from the start, rather than just planting straight into the frontier earth. Her chickens had settled in and were producing well. She had begun negotiating with a man 2 miles north about purchasing a milk cow. Henry had, by now, stopped telling himself that his Saturday visits were about being neighborly. He went because he wanted to, because the hours he spent at her property were characterized by a quality of aliveness that he had not experienced in a long time, because she made him think in ways he had forgotten he could think, and because she laughed in a way that made something in his chest do things it had no business doing. He had not said any of this to her. He was not sure how. Celia, for her part, was not unaware of what was happening. She was not a naive woman. She had felt the shift in the weeks after the 4th of July. The way his visits had changed in texture from neighborly consultation to something she could only describe as him wanting to be near her, because she recognized it because she wanted to be near him too. She found herself saving things during the week, observations about the land, questions about the area, small incidents that were worth telling, because she had an audience in mind for them. She found herself watching the road on Saturday mornings. She was also, in typical Celia fashion, extremely cautious about it, because she had come here for her land and her life, and she was not prepared to blur the one with the other without being very sure of what she was doing. It was Nell who pushed the thing, because Nell was 70 years old and had seen enough circling to know when something needed a gentle foot on the accelerator. Henry Sutton is a good man, Nell said one evening when Celia had come into town for supplies and stayed for supper, sitting at Nell's kitchen table with a cup of tea while the old woman mended by the lamp. He is, Celia agreed, carefully. He has been alone for 8 years out of some complicated conviction about women and the frontier. I'm not going to tell you everything because it is not mine to tell, but I will say that whatever he believed before you arrived, I have watched it change. And I have also watched you on Saturday mornings looking at the road. Celia was quiet for a moment. I am not going to change my life to fit someone else's expectations, she said. Nobody is asking you to, Nell said. I am suggesting that maybe the two of you have the same expectations, and the complicated part is just getting the words out. Celia looked at her tea. Talk to him, Nell said. You are the bravest person I have met in 11 years in this town. You filed a land claim alone. You built a cabin. You managed that land by yourself. You can certainly talk to a man about what you are both obviously already thinking. Celia rode home in the late evening with the stars out and the mountains dark against the sky, and she thought about what Nell had said, and she made a decision because Celia Keating was, at her core, a person who made decisions. The next day, a Sunday, she walked to Henry's ranch. He was in the yard splitting wood when she came up the road, which she noticed with a particular private warmth because she understood the rhythm of that particular work very well, the way it clears your mind and uses your body and gives you something honest to do with your hands. He stopped when he saw her and set the axe head down on the chopping block and waited. She crossed the yard and stopped a few feet from him. I need to say something, she said. All right, he said. I came out here alone and I intend to stay on my land and work it. That is not going to change. I know, he said. I am not interested in anyone who needs me to be something other than what I am, she said. I have met a great many men who find my particular nature something they want to reform or contain, and I am done with that. I would not know how to reform or contain you, Henry said, and there was something in his voice that was quiet and direct and not like reassurance at all but like simply telling the truth. I am not sure anyone could, and I am not sure why anyone would want to try. She looked at him. The morning light was full and clear, and there was no way to misread his expression. I like who you are, he said. I have liked who you are since you were standing in that creek in your canvas trousers doing work that needed to be done without waiting to be asked. I did not expect it. I had a very fixed idea about what I believed, and you walked through it the way you walked through that water, and I am not sure I have been the same since. Celia looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then she said, I like who you are too, very much. I just needed to know that you understood what that meant. I understand what it means, he said. You are Celia Keating. You have your own axe and your own land and your own mind. And if you ever let me walk beside you, it will be beside you, not in front of you and not pulling you along. I am 31 years old and I have known what I believed for a long time, and you have been here 4 months and I do not believe most of it anymore. That is a remarkable thing. She stepped forward and she kissed him, which was not what he had been expecting but which was, when he thought about it afterward, entirely characteristic of her, because Celia Keating did not wait for things she had decided she wanted. It was a good kiss, thorough and warm, and afterward they stood close together in his yard with the late morning light coming down and the sound of the horses in the pasture and the smell of cut wood, and she said, with her chin slightly lifted and the ghost of that unguarded laugh in her voice, I am telling Nell she was right. She will be insufferable about it. How bad will it be? He said. Very bad, she said. Worth it, he said, and she laughed, and he pulled her close and she let him, and they stood there like that for a while in the sunlight with the mountains behind them and everything still to come. The months that followed were some of the best of Henry Sutton's life, which he would acknowledge freely later, though at the time he was processing them with the slightly stunned quality of a man who has walked into a room he did not know existed. He began formally courting Celia, which in the frontier context meant he came to her land more days than not, that they rode together to town for supplies, that they had supper with Thomas and Martha regularly, and that he sat across from her at her small table in her cabin on Saturday evenings, with the fire going and the coffee on, and they talked for hours about everything from livestock management to what she had read most recently to the ways the territory was changing under the pressure of increasing settlement, and what that meant for the land and for the people, including the Ute people who had been in this territory long before any Homestead Act had been written, and whose displacement Celia spoke about with a directness that was unusual for the time, and that Henry, who had his own complicated thoughts on the matter, found himself working through more carefully because of her. It was not a simple or uncritical courtship. They argued. They argued about the best angle for her planned expansion to the cabin, about whether a particular horse Henry recommended was actually a good purchase, about water rights with a rancher upstream who had been taking more than his share of the creek's flow since early summer. The water rights dispute was the most serious because the rancher in question, a man named Silas Draper, was not inclined to take direction from a woman and had ignored 2 politely written notes from Celia requesting that he moderate his upstream damming. Henry had been ready to go over there directly and have a less polite conversation, which Celia had declined. I will handle it, she said. You should not have to handle it alone, he said. I am not asking you to stay out of it because I cannot manage it, she said. I am asking because if you go over there it will become your dispute with him, and it is my water right. I need him to learn to deal with me, because I intend to be here for the rest of my life. He had backed down with some difficulty, and she had ridden to Draper's property and had a conversation with him that she did not describe in full detail afterward, but that resulted in Draper moderating his damming within the week. When Henry raised an eyebrow at her over supper, she said, with a small smile, I explained the legal framework to him quite clearly, and I had brought the relevant section of the water rights claim with me. He was not expecting that. Were you worried he would become hostile? Henry asked, because Silas Draper was a large, short-tempered man and Henry had been genuinely concerned. I brought my axe, Celia said simply, and Henry stared at her for a second and then laughed, really laughed. The rare full laugh that Thomas had told Martha he had not heard from his brother in years, and that, according to Martha, was one of the best sounds in the county. Nell was indeed insufferable about being right, but she was so well-natured about it and so genuinely happy about it that it was impossible to be irritated. She had taken Celia under her wing with the commitment of someone who understood what it meant to be a woman without family in a hard country, and the relationship between them had grown into something real and mutual, the older woman sharing 11 years of hard-won knowledge about the land and the people, the younger woman bringing a liveliness and engagement that Nell, though she would not have said it plainly, had been missing. September came, and with it the first cold, and Celia's first Colorado autumn unfurled around her in colors she had not fully been prepared for, the aspens going gold, the sky going deeper, the mornings carrying a bite that clarified everything. She had her winter stores laid in, her firewood cut and stacked well past what she calculated she needed, her chicken coop weatherproofed, and a milk cow named Beatrice installed in a small shed attached to the north side of the cabin. Henry checked her firewood pile one afternoon and said nothing about it for a full minute and then said, "That is more wood than most ranchers I know have cut by this time of year." "I did not survive 17 Maine winters by underestimating them," she said. "Colorado may be different, but I did not intend to discover how different while I was freezing. How long did that take you?" 3 weeks of mornings, she said. "I have a good axe." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one where he was feeling something more than he was saying. She had come to love that expression because it was honest and careful and very Henry, and because by now she knew what it meant. "Celia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to marry you." She had been expecting this conversation for approximately 3 weeks. She had been thinking about it for roughly that long, turning it over in her mind with the same thorough attention she gave everything, examining it from the sides and underneath, making sure she understood what she was deciding. "I need you to understand something first," she said. "I know," he said. "No, I need to say it out loud." She turned to face him fully. "This land is mine, it will remain mine. I will not be absorbed into your property as an extension of your holdings. I am your equal, not your dependent." "I know," he said again, and this time his voice was very steady. "I would not have it any other way. I am asking to build a life beside you, not on top of you." She looked at him for a long moment. The aspens were gold behind him, and the sky was that deep Colorado blue, and the mountains were the mountains, and everything was very clear. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands carefully, as though she was something he was still slightly astonished to be touching, and she put her hands over his and they stayed like that for a moment in the autumn light before he kissed her, and this time it was him initiating it, which she appreciated on principle. Thomas, when informed, did an undignified thing involving his hat that made Martha and the boys laugh, and that Henry tolerated with what he felt was admirable composure. Nell said, "I know," in the tone of a woman who had already planned most of it out in her mind. They were married in the second week of October, in the small church in Dusthaven that was also used for town meetings and occasional theatrical performances, by a minister named Reverend Aldous who had a warm manner, and kept the ceremony blessedly brief, because neither Henry nor Celia were people who required elaborate ceremony. Though Martha had insisted on flowers from her own kitchen garden, and Celia had worn the dark green dress from the 4th of July, because she liked it and it was hers. The celebration afterward was at the boarding house, because Nell had simply taken over the organization of it and produced a dinner for 30 people with the authority of a general, and Pete Dolan played the fiddle again, And Henry danced every single reel because he had something to celebrate now and he intended to celebrate it properly. And Celia danced beside him, her face fully open and laughing. And Thomas watched them from across the room and put his arm around Martha and felt extremely satisfied with the state of the world. They had decided, after considerable practical discussion, that Celia's cabin would be maintained and used, but that they would live primarily at Henry's ranch house, which was larger and better established, with a plan to build a proper addition within the year. Celia's land would continue to be worked as a separate productive property, because 160 acres of decent grazing land was not something you walked away from. They would work both properties as one extended operation, which made practical and financial sense, and which also suited them both because they were people who understood that more land, properly tended, meant more resilience. The first winter together was hard in the way Colorado winters were hard, which meant very cold and very long and frequently beautiful in the particular way of things that are testing you honestly. Celia went through her first Colorado snowstorm in early December with her boots on, and her coat buttoned, and a very practical expression. And Henry watched her stand outside the ranch house in the first real blizzard of the season, and lift her face up into the snow like she was greeting it. "Well," she said, when she came back inside with snow in her hair and her cheeks red from the cold, "it is not worse than Maine." "That is the spirit," he said. They spent their evenings by the fire, which was not a hardship. They read to each other, which had begun almost by accident when Henry had picked up the book she was reading one evening and read a passage aloud, and which had become a nightly ritual they both guarded carefully. He read to her from a history of the Western territories he had been working through for 2 years, and she read to him from the novels she had brought from Boston, and they argued amiably about the characters and the history in equal measure, and the winter passed, as all winters pass eventually, into spring. In March of 1879, Celia told Henry she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before either of them had fully gotten their boots on for the day, sitting at the kitchen table with the early light coming in and the coffee made. And she told him in the same direct way she told him everything, looking him in the face and saying it clearly. His response was to set down his coffee cup very carefully and then sit for a moment with his hands flat on the table, and she watched his expression move through something complicated and settle on something that was unmistakably joy. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been watching it carefully. I feel strong and normal." "Good." He covered her hands with his. "Good." They told Thomas and Martha that Sunday over dinner, and Martha cried happy tears and Thomas shook Henry's hand so vigorously it left his shoulder sore, and Nell was told the following day and said, with great composure, "I will begin knitting," and then went very quiet for a moment in a way that suggested she was more moved than she wished to appear. Celia continued working her land throughout the spring and summer, modifying what needed to be modified as her body changed, not because anyone told her to slow down, but because she was practical about what needed to be done and what needed to wait. Henry watched her with a care that he tried to make unobtrusive and that she saw clearly and appreciated, because it was not the hovering kind of care that implied she could not manage herself, but the attentive kind that meant he was paying attention. There was a difference. They built the addition to the ranch house that spring, starting in April, a proper extension to the east side that added 2 rooms and a covered porch. Henry and Thomas did much of the framing. Celia directed the layout with her notebook and her level and her opinions, and Miguel Navarro, who had come back through the area for the season, helped with the finish work. On a warm afternoon when they were both working on the porch roof, Henry passing boards up from the ground and Celia cutting them to length with a skill saw her father had taught her, he said, without looking up from where he was measuring, "I want to apologize to you." She stopped cutting. "For what?" "For what I believed before you came here." He looked up at her. I told myself for years that no woman would truly choose this life, that they were always brought here and endured it rather than choosing it. I used that belief to justify not looking for someone, not trying, and it was wrong. It was not based on evidence. It was based on what I had watched and what I needed to believe so I could stay comfortable in my own aloneness. Celia set down the saw. She looked at him with the clear gray eyes that still, after a year of looking directly at him, made something in his chest do complicated things. "You were not entirely wrong about what you observed," she said. "Women were and are brought to places like this by circumstances they did not choose. That is real and it matters. What you were wrong about was the conclusion. Some of us also choose it." "You chose it," he said. "I chose it," she agreed. "And I would choose it again." She picked up the saw. "And I would choose you again." He stood there for a moment with a board in his hands and the spring sun on his face and all 80 acres of good grazing land around them. And he thought about the 15th of April, 1878, the stage arriving and the axe and the clear gray eyes, and about the word chose, and he thought that perhaps the rest of his life would be a very fine thing. "I am going to need those boards cut," he said, because he was Henry Sutton and he was not inclined to be overly florid about emotional revelations, and Celia laughed the good laugh and went back to work. The baby came in the first week of November, with Nell Briggs and Martha both present, and the fire built high and Henry in the next room in a state of controlled anxiety that Thomas, who had been through this twice himself, handled with the application of coffee and calm conversation. It was a boy, 8 pounds and healthy, with Henry's dark hair and Celia's gray eyes, which Martha said was the most appropriate possible outcome. They named him Patrick James Sutton, for Celia's father and for Henry's grandfather. Henry held him that first evening in the firelight, careful and deliberate in the way he was careful and deliberate about everything important, and Celia watched him from the bed with a tiredness that went all the way down and a joy that matched it equally. And she thought about her father in his workshop in Maine with the smell of sawdust and the sound of the axe. And she thought about the railroad station in Boston and the long journey west and the flat rock by the creek where she had made her lists on her first morning on her own land. And she thought, I chose all of this, every piece of it. She would not have changed a single thing. Spring of 1880 arrived with a warmth that seemed to come early and stay, and by that time, the combined Sutton operation had expanded in several directions. Henry had acquired 20 additional head of cattle the previous autumn, and the calving season was going well. Celia's land, under her management, was producing hay that she was baling and selling to 3 nearby ranches, which had turned the 160 acres into a genuinely profitable enterprise separate from the cattle operation. She had planted fruit trees along the south-facing slope of her land the previous spring, apple and plum varieties hardy enough for the climate, and they were taking well. Patrick, who at 5 months old had the alert, suspicious expression of a person taking detailed notes on everything around him, accompanied Celia to the land on good weather days in a carrier basket that Henry had built with obsessive care from a pattern Nell had drawn for him, and was generally regarded by the chickens with mutual indifference, and by Beatrice the cow with what appeared to be fond recognition. Nell Briggs, who was now officially part of the extended family in every way that mattered, spent one afternoon a week at the ranch helping with Patrick and extracting payment in the form of conversation and the occasional use of Celia's kitchen garden. She had in the previous year declined 2 offers to move into a smaller, more manageable property, and instead reinforced her boarding house roof herself with help from Juan Navarro, because she was Nell and she was not going anywhere. One warm evening in June of 1880, Henry and Celia sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late light with Patrick asleep in the basket between them and the mountains going through their evening colors and the sound of the creek in the distance. "I have been thinking," Celia said. "That is never a simple thing with you," he said, without looking up from the harness he was mending. "I want to expand the hay operation to include a second cutting in late summer. If we divert the creek channel slightly near the upper boundary of my claim, we can irrigate a larger section. Miguel says it is feasible. Miguel says most things are feasible. Miguel is usually right. Henry set down the harness. Walk me through the channel diversion. She did from memory precisely because she had been working it out in her head for 2 weeks. He asked questions. She answered them. They went back and forth for half an hour in the evening light and arrived at a plan that was better than either had brought to it. Because that was what happened when they worked on something together. Each of them adding something the other had not seen. The two of them arriving at better answers than either would alone. Patrick made a small sound in his sleep, and they both looked at him at the same time, and then looked at each other, and something passed between them. Wordless and warm and enormous. The particular thing that cannot be said because language is not quite big enough for it, but that passes between two people who are making a life together and know it. We are going to need more firewood before October, Henry said. I know, Celia said. I have been planning it. He picked up his harness and went back to mending it, and she picked up the letter she had been writing to her brother in Maine, and the summer evening settled around them, complete and full and entirely theirs. There were harder things because this was the frontier and there were always harder things. A drought in the late summer of 1880 stretched the creek thin and required careful management of both properties' water use. And there were weeks of long work and tight margins that they got through on competence and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. A man passing through the county that autumn who had been drinking too freely made some remarks about Celia's operation in the general store in Dusthaven that resulted in Henry and Thomas both arriving there in a way that the man found persuasive enough to move along. And Celia was both grateful and exasperated, because she had been prepared to handle it herself. And the next time she said so to Henry he nodded, and said she was right, and that he had acted on instinct and would try to hold that instinct better. And because he was honest about it, she believed him and they moved on. The drought broke in September and the creek came back strong, and they finished their fall stores with a reasonable margin. In the winter of 1881, Celia's youngest brother, Daniel, wrote from Maine that he was thinking of coming west. He was 22 years old, unmarried, a carpenter and woodworker like their father had been, and Celia wrote him back a long letter about what the West actually was, not the advertisement version, not the romantic version, but the real version, the cold and the work and the extraordinary sky, and the way the land got into you if you let it. She told him exactly what it would cost him to start and what he would need to know before he came, because she was Celia, and she did not protect people from the truth. Daniel arrived in April of 1882 and stepped off the stage in Dusthaven looking around with a young man's bright, uncertain eyes, and Celia was there to meet him, and she hugged him hard, which surprised them both because she had never been a particularly demonstrative person. But 3 years and 2,000 miles do things to a person's relationship with restraint. Henry met him with a handshake and a frank evaluation that Daniel passed, apparently, because Henry said within the first hour that he could use a skilled carpenter on the ranch expansion he had been planning, and that if Daniel wanted to start there while he found his own footing, the offer was open. Daniel found his footing with reasonable speed, because he was his father's son and his sister's brother, and he had read her letter carefully and come prepared. He eventually filed his own land claim 6 miles northeast of Celia's, and he built a solid cabin the first summer with his own hands and the assistance of the Navarro brothers, who had by now become reliable fixtures in the area, and he became, gradually, a good neighbor and a good man in the particular way the frontier made good men out of people who were willing to be made. Patrick Sutton grew into a child of strong opinions and considerable physical energy, which surprised no one. He walked early and spoke early and had, by the time he was 2 years old, developed a habit of picking up any tool he could reach and attempting to use it for something, which resulted in one memorable afternoon involving Celia's felling axe and the garden fence, and a very serious conversation about what is and is not appropriate for a 2-year-old, which Patrick received with what his mother felt was insufficient remorse. He was going to be like her. Henry said so with a mix of pride and gentle terror that Celia found very endearing. In November of 1882, Celia discovered she was expecting their second child, which she calculated would arrive in the following summer. She told Henry over breakfast with the same directness she told him everything, and his response was the same careful, quiet joy, and she thought that this was one of the things she loved most about him, that he responded to good things with the fullness they deserved. "Patrick is going to be difficult about this," Henry said. "He is going to be exactly as difficult as we allow him to be," Celia said, which was true, and which they both knew from experience. The second child, born in July of 1883 on a morning when the mountains were sharp and clear, and the hay was high in the fields, was a girl, which Patrick found more interesting than he had anticipated, having prepared himself to be contemptuous and discovering instead a small person who looked at him with large dark eyes that seemed to find him genuinely compelling. They named her Bridget for Celia's mother, and she had red hair, more red than Celia's auburn, which made Nell say with great satisfaction that some things announced their intentions clearly from the beginning. The summer of 1883 stretched out long and golden, and the ranch was full and the land was producing, and the cabin on Celia's claim was being used now as storage, and as a place where she kept her records and her planning materials, her notebooks of lists and observations, and the careful accounts she kept of every season's work. She went out there alone sometimes in the early mornings, before the household came fully awake, and sat on the stone step she had cut herself 5 years ago and watched the creek and the mountains, and she thought about the woman who had made all those lists on this stone in her first spring here, precise and alone and certain. She was still precise. She was still certain. She was not alone. One morning in September of 1883, Henry came and found her there, having gotten up earlier than usual because Bridget had woken at dawn and settled again, and he had found himself awake and walking. He came over the rise and found her on her stone with her coffee and her notebook, and she did not look surprised to see him, because she rarely looked surprised by things she had halfway expected. He sat down on the ground beside her stone because there was only one flat stone and it was hers. "I was thinking about that axe," he said. She looked at him. "The axe. The day the stage came in. I was standing outside the general store and I watched you step down and I noticed the axe first. Not your face, not your coat, the axe. And I thought, a woman who carries a working axe like an umbrella has made some decisions about her life." "And what did you conclude?" she said. "I concluded exactly nothing because I was operating at the time on a theory that kept me from concluding anything useful." He looked at the mountains. "But somewhere underneath that I think I knew. Something shifted when I saw it." Celia looked at the axe, which was leaning against the wall of the cabin behind her. It was 5 years older now, but otherwise unchanged, still dark-handled, still well-kept, still belonging to her the way things you have known and used for most of your life belong to you. "Papa used to say that a good axe is the most honest tool there is," she said. "You cannot pretend with it. It does what you do with it, nothing more and nothing less. The work is the work." Henry looked at her. The morning light was early and clear, the kind of September light that has autumn already in it, and she was sitting with her coffee and her notebook and the axe leaning on the wall behind her. And she was 30 years old now, and the woman he knew better than he had ever known anything. And he thought about the 15th of April, 1878, and the axe hitting the fence post that nobody had actually seen it hit because that was a story that had grown in the telling around town. And about the creek and the dancing and the kitchen table and the porch and all the days between, and he thought, "I was wrong about everything I believed, and I was right to have been corrected." "She arrived with her own axe," he said, half to himself. Celia looked at him with a slight smile. "And proved you wrong." "Thoroughly," he said. "Good," she said, and handed him what remained of her coffee because she was done with it and he had not brought any, and he took it and they sat together on the stone step, and the creek ran, and the mountains were the mountains, and the day opened around them with all the work and the goodness it held. The years built on each other the way good years do, each one adding something to what had come before without erasing it. Patrick grew into a boy of 10 who could fix a fence, do sums, and argue with his mother about the most efficient method of stacking firewood with a commitment that Henry found equal parts exasperating and deeply funny. Bridget at 7 was quieter, more observant, with a gift for finding things, lost objects, animal tracks, the first wildflowers of spring, things that required you to look carefully at the world around you and notice what was actually there. Daniel Keating's land 6 miles northeast had grown into a working farm with a proper house that he had built entirely himself. And in the spring of 1886, he married a woman named Rosa Garza from a Mexican-American family who had been in Colorado for 2 generations. And Celia welcomed her into the family with a warmth that came from genuine recognition, because Rosa was a woman who had also made decisions about her life and knew exactly what they meant. Nell Briggs, somewhere in her mid-60s now, had finally accepted that the boarding house was too much for one person, and had taken on a young woman named Harriet to help run it. And Harriet turned out to be invaluable and also extremely attached to Nell, in a way that meant Nell was never actually going to be without someone to talk to, which was, as Henry observed privately to Celia, probably the plan all along. The Sutton Ranch, by the end of the 1880s, was one of the established operations in the county, not the largest but solid and well-managed and known for the quality of its cattle and the quality of the people who ran it. Celia's hay land had expanded twice, as she had planned, and she had added a small apple orchard on the south slope that was now producing well enough to sell through the general store in town. And she kept the accounts of both properties with the same precise attention she gave everything, and the notebooks accumulated on the shelf in the cabin on her claim, a record of every season and every decision. In 1887, Henry and Celia sat down one evening and looked at those accounts together, and at the land, and at their children, and at each other, and they talked about what came next, in the particular quiet shorthand of 2 people who have been thinking beside each other long enough that they know how the other's mind moves. "I want to build a proper barn on the claim land," Celia said. "The hay operation needs better storage, and if we have the barn we can winter additional stock over there instead of bringing everything down here. The foundation will need to be done before the ground freezes," Henry said. "I know. I have been looking at timelines. If we start in August, we can have the foundation and the walls up before October. I will contact the Navarro brothers. Miguel is in New Mexico until September," she said, "but Juan is here. I already asked him." He looked at her. "You already asked him?" "I was going to tell you tonight," she said, without any trace of guilt. "Of course you were," he said, and he was smiling. The full smile that she had worked out fairly early on was the rarest and most genuine smile in his repertoire, the one that reached his eyes and made him look like someone who had decided to be entirely himself for a moment. "How did you know I would agree?" She considered this seriously. "I knew because you have never, in 10 years of marriage, tried to stop me from doing anything that made practical sense," she said. "And because you understand that this land is mine and what I build on it is mine, and you have always understood what that meant." He held her gaze for a moment and she held his. "I understood what it meant from the creek," he said. "You believed it from the creek," she said. "You understood it about a year later." He laughed. She laughed. Patrick, passing through the room in search of a book he had left somewhere, looked at his parents and sighed the sigh of a 12-year-old who finds his parents' mutual amusement inexplicable, and continued his search. The barn went up in the autumn of 1887, and it was excellent. Juan Navarro was as good as his brother, and Henry and Daniel both worked on the framing, and Celia directed the layout with her level and her notebook. And when it was done, she stood in the center of it with the afternoon light coming through the high windows, and ran her hand along the timber she had chosen herself, and felt the same thing she had felt standing in the cabin for the first time 15 years ago. The satisfaction of a thing built right. Henry found her there and stood beside her without saying anything for a while, which was one of the things she had always loved about him. He knew when things needed words and when they needed only presence. "Good barn," he said eventually. "Very good barn," she agreed. "Your father would have approved." She looked at him quickly. He was still looking at the timber, steady and sincere. "Yes," she said after a moment, "he would have." The last evening of the summer of 1888, when Patrick was 13 and Bridget was 5, and the apple orchard on the south slope had its best crop yet, and the hay had been cut twice, and the cattle were fat, and the creek ran clear and cold through the golden September grass, Henry and Celia sat together on the porch of the ranch house and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. It was not a momentous evening. Nothing particular had happened that day. The work had been the work, and the children were in bed, and the coffee was on the table between them, and the stars were coming out over the Colorado dark. "Are you happy?" Henry said. Celia turned the question over in her mind with the same care she gave everything, because she was Celia and she did not answer questions like that carelessly. "Yes," she said, "more than I planned for." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the dark with the mountains around them and the land around them and the years of it all, and everything was closed and whole and exactly what she had chosen. Down by the cabin on the claim, the axe stood against the wall on its step where she had left it that morning, dark-handled and honest, the way her father had left her, the way good things persist. Above them the Colorado stars came out one by one and then all at once, brilliant and particular and ancient, indifferent to everything below them except that everything below them was alive in that light. Henry Sutton's broad hand over Celia Keating's capable one, and the sound of the creek in the dark, and 10 years built into something that would last.